Welcome back to the Rundown. Well, the last few years has seen a number of U.S. states enact laws or regulations that are aimed at countering the BDS movement, which promotes boycotting, divesting from, and sanctioning Israel over its policies toward the Palestinians. Today, new federal legislation was proposed in Congress with a similar goal, the Export Administration Anti-Discrimination Act. That bill was introduced by Republican Congressman from Florida, Ron DeSantis, who joins us now from Washington. First of all, Congressman, thank you for joining us on I-24 News' The Rundown.
Sure, happy to be here.
Now, as I mentioned, there are a number of states that have tried to, or have actually put forward laws or regulations against BDS. Explain to us about your bill and the bill of, I know that you have other sponsors on, and why you feel that federal legislation is needed.
Well, this is a much more comprehensive approach, and I support a lot of the things that some of the states, like Florida, for example, has done. A lot of the state legislation is more narrowly focused. I mean, for example, Florida, if you're engaging in BDS, then the state won't contract with you, and I support that restriction, but this goes beyond that. It's more of a comprehensive national policy against BDS, against those who will target Israel, but really it's not even limited to that. If there are friendly nations that we have relationships with beyond Israel, the same protections would apply. At the end of the day, we want the U.S., the elected U.S. government, conducting foreign policy, and we don't want this stuff to be done in kind of a subterranean way by certain groups. And we've seen some of that happen with respect to Israel. So I think it's a good antidote to the BDS movement specifically, but I also think it provides a more sound basis for conducting foreign policy more generally.
Congressman, people even here in Israel, it is a divisive issue here as well, say, well, BDS is just one form of expression that is legitimate in a democracy like Israel is. So what do you say to those who say, well, people should be free to make those decisions if they wish?
Well, if you look at BDS, though, and people admit this, I mean, it's being used as a way to attack and delegitimize the state of Israel. It is rooted in anti-Semitism, and I think there have been people that have been honest about that, because you can't just come out and say you're anti-Semitic. That's not necessarily going to be as effective if you do BDS and you try to say, oh, well, we're just responding to Israel's conduct, so we have to do this. Well, guess what? When I did the first BDS hearing in the Congress a couple years ago, we had protesters who were there protesting in favor of boycotting and sanctioning Israel. The funny thing about it, though, is those exact same protesters were at a hearing I was at earlier in the day where they were saying we shouldn't sanction or boycott Iran, which is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. So I think the proof's in the pudding. A lot of the people who pursue BDS, they don't want to sanction any of these rogue regimes. They're just concerned with sanctioning the world's only Jewish state. So it's a crock, and it's not a free expression thing. It is a targeted campaign to delegitimize the world's only, the Middle East's only democracy and the world's only Jewish state.
Congressman, there has been talk for, at least for, let's say, a couple of years of some kind of federal legislation against BDS. It really hasn't seemed to progress. Are you confident that your proposal will go through, and can you give us some kind of timeline that you see for its passage?
Well, if you know the Congress, I don't think you could ever be confident that things progress through the United States Senate. So in the House, my bill is co-sponsored by the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, which has primary jurisdiction over this issue. So I'm confident we will mark it up and hopefully send it to the House floor. What happens beyond that, I'm not sure. But I will say there is a lot more movement on BDS this Congress than there has been in previous Congresses, and I think there is a recognition that we do need to get something across the finish line. So I'm hoping it's my bill, but at a minimum, I think we can get at least proponent or different parts of various bills and have some type of a package by the year's end. That would be my hope.
Well, if we're already talking about Middle East and the Trump administration towards the Middle East, we know there is that sort of potential peace plan in the air. Jason Greenblatt and Jared Kushner are expected to come back to this region for some key meetings on that over the next couple of weeks. What is your understanding in Congress of where that peace plan stands, and are we going to see it anytime soon?
I'm not sure when the proposal will be generated. I think the view in Congress is generally one of real serious skepticism that there are conditions available to have any type of lasting Arab-Israeli peace in this regard. And the main reason is Palestinian Arabs have still not accepted Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. You look at the different things they do to incite their population. You look at the fact that they're paying terrorist families money. We had to do the Taylor Force Act as a response to that. None of that, I think, demonstrates a real willingness to do this. And I think my judgment and the judgment, I think a majority of my colleagues here in the Congress, is that Israel has shown it's been willing to make some serious concessions, but basically has been spurned every time. And I don't see the conditions as being ripe to actually get something done here.
Congressman, you've also suggested legislation recognizing the Golan Heights as officially Israeli territory, agreeing with Israel's position of its sovereignty over that disputed area with Syria. Even the Trump administration has not taken any kind of steps or shown any support for in that direction. Do you think that realistically that is a stance that you can move even with your own Republican administration?
Well, you know, when I went to Israel in the March of 2017 on the mission to identify sites to move the American embassy, a lot of people said the same thing. Oh, it's not going to happen. All the presidents promised it. Don't worry. I kept my nose to the grindstone and really did all I could in the Congress to raise the temperature on the embassy issue. And the president's credit, he pulled the trigger. So I think it's a similar thing here. Look, at the end of the day, if you're identifying Syria policy, U.S. Syria, dealing with the whole region, however you slice or dice it, there is no coherent policy that would want to see the Golan Heights given to who? Hezbollah, Iran, what's left of Assad's regime? I mean, give me a break. It's a strategically significant area, and I think that we are better off as Americans, and I think the region is more secure and stable when that's under Israeli sovereignty. So I just cannot conceive of a reason why we would insist on that ever being relinquished. And so we should just recognize the obvious, like we did with Jerusalem. The facts on the ground are Jerusalem's Israel's capital. Let's recognize it. And the facts on the ground are the Golan Heights is, in fact, part of Israel.
All right, Congressman Ron DeSantis, in just about 15 minutes, that report from the Justice Department officially set to be released. We're talking about the sort of internal inspection of both the DOJ and the FBI's conduct during the 2016 election. First of all, has Congress been briefed on the contents of that report at this point?
I've been briefed. I know other members have been. I'm not sure if the Congress as a whole, and I've been given a copy of the report.
And your take from what you've seen, I know it's 500 pages. You probably haven't made your way all the way through it, but what are your takeaways so far?
Well, I'm really concerned. You know, this IG report really only focuses on mid-year exam, which was the Hillary Clinton investigation about whether she compromised classified information using an unsecured private email server. I've been really concerned with potential misconduct involving the so-called Crossfire Hurricane investigation, which was the collusion investigation between Trump's campaign and Russia. And there's a text message in the IG report that was not disclosed to Congress when we asked for it, in which Lisa Page, the FBI counsel, texted her lover, the head of counterintelligence leading the collusion investigation, Peter Strzok. She said, Trump is not really going to be president, right? And Peter Strzok's response was, no, he will not. We won't let that happen. We'll stop him. And that is something that is just an absolute appalling example of bias. We and the FBI will stop him. This is the same agent said that you need an insurance policy in case Trump became president. And so the bias that you see there, I think, is probably more significant than some of the bias in the Hillary case. Comey had huge amounts of mistakes, and I think the guy should never have been FBI director. But the Peter Strzok and how he started that collusion investigation and how he really drove that, given his bias and given the fact that he's texting saying we'll stop Trump from being president, that damages the FBI's reputation to no end.
Congressman, you're talking about alleged bias within the FBI and from James Comey himself towards the Trump campaign. But what do you say to those who say, well, Comey himself, days before the election, held that press conference. He certainly continued to break with sort of FBI protocol in doing that. And those who say he cost Hillary Clinton the election and actually helped President Donald Trump.
Well, I don't know if he cost her the election. I do think it was improper, the fact that he did that. That's not the way these investigations are supposed to start. But the reason he had to do it is because he gave that ridiculous press conference on July 5th in which he exonerated her. So people say, oh, Comey hurt Clinton by giving the October 28th statement or the leak. Maybe, but understand, he gave Hillary the biggest gift of all by exonerating her, because there's no doubt that she was grossly negligent in handling classified information. Heck, he even admitted it. He just said, oh, well, she didn't intend to harm the U.S., which was not an element of the offense. And so if you would have had somebody in our military, kind of a junior officer or mid-level enlisted, they would have been court-martialed for that. So whatever Comey did that ended up hurting Hillary was far outweighed by his decision to unilaterally exonerate her when, in fact, the statute, as applied reasonably, would have said that she was likely to be guilty of that offense.
Congressman, if I could return to foreign affairs for a moment. The North Korea summit, there are some lawmakers, including Republicans, while supportive of the president in the process, are concerned he may be going too fast. He may be, in a sense, warming up too much to Kim Jong-un. You're part of the Congress that deals with foreign affairs. Do you think you have a responsibility, your colleagues, to have some oversight of this process?
Well, of course. I mean, we have oversight over all the agencies, State Department and the relevant agencies. But, you know, a lot of these people who are complaining, they never had any answers about how to deal with North Korea. This is a problem that's festered for 25 years. The most recent administration did virtually nothing. And actually, Obama wanted to meet with Kim Jong-un. He wanted to do it. Kim Jong-un wouldn't meet with him. And I think the reason why Kim Jong-un wanted to meet with Trump, or was willing to, is because Trump is somebody that he respects as somebody who is a strong leader and may actually be willing to hold Kim accountable. I don't think he ever feared Barack Obama. So I think he's worried about what Trump has done by bringing up so much pressure to bear on his little regime.
Let's talk specifics, though. President Trump, after putting out that joint statement, just as he touched down in the United States, tweeted out that the North Korea nuclear threat is over. I mean, is that a realistic statement to be making less than 24 hours after a summit and a pretty vague statement put out before the real deal making has begun?
Well, I think the president knows what was discussed better than I do. I think that he's convinced that this was kind of the road where we start going down to denuclearization, and I think he thinks there'll be no turning back, because I think if Kim Jong-un tries to turn back, the consequences will be way worse. So I think that's how the president's seeing it. Look, time's going to tell on all this. If you denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, it's going to be a huge, huge win for peace and security in the world. On the other hand, this regime has a history of cheating and lying and violating different understandings. But I think the president understands that, and I don't think he's going to let Kim Jong-un snooker him. So we'll just have to see how it all shakes out. But the negotiations were not happening in a vacuum. The reason you had them is because you had the pressure campaign, you had a credible threat of force, and you had a president who really upped the rhetoric. And I think that rattled the regime and rattled Kim Jong-un.
Congressman, in the minute we have left, if we're talking about a history in North Korea, that regime also certainly has a history of brutal human rights violations documented for decades. That was not something that was brought up or mentioned. President Trump said that he needs to open a new page and that is no longer relevant. Do you agree that the U.S. can just turn a blind eye to those abuses?
Well, look, it's a Stalinist country. It's a very repressive dictatorship. And I don't know what was discussed in terms of economic possibilities with North Korea. I have no idea if Kim Jong-un would even understand the idea that his country could be much wealthier if they didn't have a totalitarian system and a Stalinist ideology. But But I do think if you actually did get some private enterprise in there, I think that would increase the power of the people. Now, the devil's going to be in the details because these regimes have a history of taking all the gains and profit for themselves and allowing their people to continue to suffer.
Okay, Congressman Ron DeSantis on Capitol Hill.